Penguins are able to drink seawater directly, a capacity that would prove fatal for most animals, because they possess a specialized organ called the supraorbital gland located just above the eye. This gland filters excess salt from the bloodstream with remarkable efficiency, concentrating it and expelling it as a saline liquid through the nasal passages. The head shaking or sneezing-like motion that penguins periodically perform is this excretion process in action. They are flickering away the concentrated salt solution their bodies have extracted. Thanks to this biological filtration system, penguins can spend extended periods at sea without access to fresh water, sustaining themselves entirely on what the ocean provides. The supraorbital gland is found in various seabirds as well, but in penguins it is particularly well developed, reflecting the demands of a life more thoroughly committed to the marine environment than that of almost any other bird. In the city-states of ancient Greece, a person who showed no interest in public affairs, who withdrew entirely into private life and refused to engage with politics and collective concerns, was described by a word that is the ancestor of the modern English term idiot. In contemporary usage, the word implies a lack of intelligence, but in ancient Athens it carried no such meaning. It described instead a moral and civic failure, the abdication of one's responsibilities as a member of a democratic society, to opt out of debate, to ignore the vote, to remain indifferent to the fate of the community. This was considered a form of disgrace, a failure of what it meant to be a civilized person. Tracing the word's evolution from a term of civic criticism to one of cognitive insult reveals how dramatically our sense of what constitutes a social failing has shifted over 2.5 millennia. And the original meaning carries a challenge that has not entirely lost its relevance. In a democracy, withdrawal from public life was once considered a kind of failure of character. The stomach secretes powerful enzymes and hydrochloric acid to break down food. Yet, it is itself made of protein, which means it is, in principle, capable of digesting itself. The reason it does not is a combination of defense mechanisms that operate in close coordination. The inner wall of the stomach is coated with a thick layer of mucus that physically separates the acid from the tissue beneath it. More remarkably, the cells lining the stomach are replaced at an extraordinary rate. The entire mucosal surface is renewed in a matter of days, meaning that any damage is repaired almost as quickly as it occurs. When the balance between this protective system and the stomach's digestive activity is disrupted by prolonged stress, infection, or certain medications, the acid begins to breach the defenses and attack the stomach wall itself, producing the pain and erosion characteristic of a gastric ulcer. The fact that we can eat a meal comfortably every day without our stomach dissolving from the inside is the result of a continuous and invisible act of self-maintenance that the body performs without pause. Papua New Guinea is home to more distinct languages than any other country on Earth, with estimates placing the total above 800. This extraordinary linguistic diversity is a product of the country's geography. Rugged mountain ranges, dense rainforest, and a scattering of islands created conditions in which communities remained isolated from one another for 1,000 of years, each developing its own language independently. The isolation was so effective that neighboring villages can be mutable, unintelligible. In some regions, the language of a community just a few kilometers away is entirely foreign. English and Tok Pisin serve as a common language in formal contexts, but the hundreds of indigenous languages remain the living heart of their communities' identities and cultural knowledge. Sustaining a society of such profound linguistic variety requires a depth of mutual respect that has been cultivated over generations. For linguists, the country is a field of extraordinary richness. For the world at large, it is a reminder that human language is far more diverse and far more fragile than it is generally appreciated. The liver of a polar bear contains concentrations of vitamin A so extreme that a single serving is potentially lethal to a human being. Vitamin A is an essential nutrient in appropriate quantities, supporting vision and cellular health, but it is fat-soluble, meaning the body cannot easily excrete excess amounts. And at high doses, it causes a condition known as hypervitaminosis A, with symptoms including severe headaches, increased intracranial pressure, nausea, and the peeling of skin across the body. Historical records from Arctic exploration include multiple documented cases of expeditioners who, facing food shortages, consumed polar bear liver and died or became gravely ill as a result. The polar bear itself is unaffected. It has evolved a metabolic system that accumulates vitamin A absorbed from the seals it eats, concentrating it in their liver without harmful consequences to the animal. What is a survival adaptation in one species become a concentrated poison in another. The polar bear's liver is a vivid example of how the same substance can function as a biological tool for one organism and a lethal hazard for another, depending entirely on the physiology of the consumer. For roughly the first 6 to 7 months of life, human babies possess an ability that adults have permanently lost. They can swallow and breathe through the nose at the same time. This is possible because in newborns, the larynx sits much higher in the throat than it does in adults, allowing the soft palate and epiglottis to overlap and create two completely separate passages, one for food, one for air. The result is that a baby can nurse for extended periods without becoming short of breath, taking in nutrition and oxygen simultaneously. As the infant grows, develops solid food intake, and begins acquiring the complex vocal anatomy needed for speech, the larynx gradually descends to its adult position, and this dual capability is lost. The anatomical shift is, in a sense, the physical price of language, the trade-off evolution made to give humans the sophisticated vocal range that speech requires. It is one of the more quietly elegant designs found in the early weeks of human life. Dogs have almost no sweat glands distributed across their bodies the way humans do. But there is one exception, the paw pads, which contain sweat-secreting glands that assist with temperature regulation and traction. When a dog is nervous or excited, its paw prints may appear slightly damp, evidence of those glands at work, adding moisture to increase friction against the ground and enabling sharp turns and full-speed sprints. The skin of the paw pad is also notably thick and elastic, functioning as a shock-absorbing cushion that allows dogs to run across a wide range of surfaces without footwear. Because the area capable of sweating is so limited, dogs must rely primarily on panting to manage body heat in warm conditions, which makes them more susceptible to heat exhaustions than humans. The faintly toasty scent that the many dog owners notice from their dog's paws is the result of compounds in that sweat interacting with the bacteria naturally present on the skin, and for those paying close attention, it can serve as a subtle indicator of the dog's overall health. If all the axons and dendrites making up the neutral network of a single human brain were stretched out end to end, the total length would reach approximately 1 million kilometers, enough to circle the Earth 25 times, or to travel to the moon and back more than once. This extraordinary density of wiring is what allows us to react instantly to external stimuli, retrieve complex memories, and process intricate emotions. The connection points between neurons, synapses, are not static. New ones are formed and existing ones strengthened through experience and learning, meaning this million-kilometer network is continuously being rewritten throughout a person's lifetime. Contemplating the fact that what we experience as thought and consciousness is, at a physical level, The activity of a galaxy-like circuit folded into the space of a human skull makes the brain's energy's demands feel entirely justified. The invisible microscopic scale at which it operates only deepens the sense of wonder. The idea that a banana peel on the ground is dangerously slippery is not merely a cartoon convention. It has been verified experimentally. The inner surface of a banana peel contains microscopic granules packed with polysaccharides, a type of viscous compound. When weight is applied and the granules are compressed, they rupture and release a fluid that acts as a lubricant between the sole of a shoe and the ground. The friction coefficient drops dramatically as a result, producing a surface comparable in slipperiness to ice. A Japanese research team that measured this effect and quantified the friction coefficient of banana peel was awarded an Ig Nobel Prize for their efforts. It is worth noting that a dried peel loses much of this hazard, while a freshly peeled one retains the most moisture and presents the greatest risk. The science of the banana peel is, ultimately, a case for a basic courtesy. Once you have enjoyed the fruit, throw the peel away. When the height of Mount Everest was first precisely measured by a British survey team in the 19th century, the figure obtained came out to exactly 29,000 feet, a suspiciously round number. The surveyor in charge, Andrew Wall, was concerned that such a perfectly neat result would lead people to assume the measurement had been rounded off rather than rigorously calculated. To demonstrate the precision and integrity of the work, he deliberately added 2 feet to the published figure, announcing the official height as 29,002 feet. Modern GPS-based measurements have since produced more accurate figures, and ongoing tectonic activity continues to add a few millimeters to the mountain's height every year. The story of those 2 added feet is a small but telling window into the psychology of scientific credibility. A surveyor's attempt to make an exact measurement look less exact so that people would believe it was real. The sloth's digestive process is an unhurried, as everything else about its existence. A single meal of leaves can take up to 2 weeks to fully process, and in some cases closer to a month. The leaves that make up their diet are tough, fibrous, and low in nutritional value. So the stomach harbors a community of specialized bacteria that break down the plant matter through prolonged fermentation. The stomach itself is proportionally enormous. The food being digested can account up to a third of the animal's total body weight at any given time. meaning the sloth is essentially always full. This glacially slow digestion is precisely what allows them to survive on such meager energy input, supporting the once-a-week descent to the ground for defecation and the near total stillness that defines their daily life. In the sloth, even one of the most fundamental biological processes has been pushed to its absolute minimum speed. A whole body commitment to the principle of doing less with less, carried to its logical extreme. The ancient Egyptians had a remarkably precise command of the mathematical concepts that underpin modern arithmetic, and they applied fractions and geometry routinely in the construction of pyramids and the surveying of farmland. Because the annual flooding of the Nile repeatedly erased boundary markers, sophisticated land measurement techniques were essential, and calculations involving right triangle ratios were performed at a practical working level. Egyptian fractions followed a distinctive system. Only unit fractions, those with the numerator of 1, were used, and any other value had to be expressed as a sum of these. The fraction 3/4, for instance, would be written as 1/2 plus 1/4. This system was highly practical for everyday tasks, such as dividing rations of bread and beer equitably among large numbers of people. Mathematical problems and their worked solutions survive on papyrus scrolls, testifying to the logical sophistication with which people thousands of years ago built and sustained one of history's greatest civilizations. Fingerprints are shaped by a combination of genetic inheritance and the specific physical conditions experienced during fetal development. Identical twins share the same genetic blueprint, so the broad category of fingerprint pattern, whorl, loop, or arch tends to be similar. But the precise arrangement of ridge endings and bifurcations is influenced by the random movements of the fingertips through amniotic fluid, by subtle variations in position and pressure within the womb, and by other physical factors that differ even between twins sharing the same uterine environment. The prints form between roughly 10 and 24 weeks of pregnancy. In forensic science, this individuality is meaningful. The fingerprint identification remains valid even for identical twins, though very similar prints can occasionally pose a challenge for lower precision recognition systems. The fact that two people with identical DNA can carry different marks on their fingertips from the moment of birth is a striking reminder that genetic information alone does not determine everything about who we are. Angel Falls in the Tepuy Highlands of Venezuela drops approximately 979 meters, roughly 1.5 times the height of Tokyo Skytree, making it the tallest waterfall on Earth by a considerable margin. From that height, water does not simply fall and land. It has so far to travel that wind and air resistance begin to work on it during the descent. On hot, dry days with strong winds, a significant portion of the water disperses into fine mist before reaching the base, meaning the volume water arriving at the ground can be substantially less than what leaves the cliff edge at the top. In the rainy season, greater flow means more water completes the journey intact. The region sits atop a tepuy, a sheer-sided mesa with near vertical walls, and remained largely unknown to the outside world until 1937, when an American aviator, Jimmy Angel, spotted it from the air and brought it to international attention. The sight of a waterfall dissolving into a mist as it falls is one of nature's more extraordinary spectacles, and one that only geography on this scale can produce. Switzerland is known internationally for its permanent neutrality. But this neutrality is backed by a level of civil preparedness that extends well beyond the military. Swiss law has long required that residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and other structures include blast-resistant shelters capable of housing other occupants. The result is that the combined shelter capacity across the country exceeds the total national population, meaning every resident has been assigned shelter to go to in the event of a major emergency, including nuclear conflict. The system was developed more intensively during the Cold War, and while some aspects have been reviewed since then, the fundamental infrastructure remains in place. In peacetime, the shelters serve as storage rooms and parking spaces designed to be rapidly converted when needed. That a small landlocked nation has chosen to invest so thoroughly in civilian-level preparedness as part of its strategy for maintaining independence and neutrality is a concrete expression of what it takes to stay neutral in a world that is not always peaceful. Modern Christmas cards trace their origins to London in 1843, when a merchant named Henry Cole commissioned an artist, John Callot Horsley, to design a printed card that could be sent to friends and acquaintances as a convenient alternative to a handwritten letter. The timing coincided with postal reforms in Britain that had dramatically reduced the cost of sending mail, making the postal system accessible to ordinary people for the first time and creating the conditions for a greeting card culture to take root. The custom spread through Europe and eventually to America, becoming established as the seasonal tradition. Japan's Nengajo, the New Year's card, has older roots, descending from New Year's greetings exchanged since the Heian period, through the modern printed postcard form being widespread after the postal system was modernized in the Meiji area. Across cultures, the impulse to mark a turning point in a year by reaching out to people one cares about reflects something consistent in human social nature, a desire to maintain connection across distance and time. A hill in New Zealand's North Island bears what Guinness World Records has recognized as the longest place name in the world. An 85-letter Maori name that translates, in broad terms, a description of the place where Taimitia, the man with big knees who slid, climbed and swallowed mountains, played his flute to his loved one. In Maori culture, place names are not merely labels, but vessels carrying the stories and ancestral memories of a location. A name can function as a compressed narrative, preserving history in a form that travels with the land. The hill is ordinarily referred to by a much shorter version of the name, and the full 85-letter form appears on a signboard at the site, which has become a destination for visitors. The existence of a place name that reads like a line of oral poetry is a reflection of the worldview in which the landscape and the stories told about it are inseparable. Snail mucus has served purposes far beyond locomotion throughout human history. Records attributed to Hippocrates, an ancient Greek physician, include references to applying snail secretions to burns and skin inflammation. Modern research has confirmed that the mucus contains allantoin, a compound that supports protein synthesis and cell repair, as well as glycolic acid, which promotes skin generation, giving scientific grounding to what ancient practitioners had discovered empirically. The contemporary cosmetics industry, particularly in South Korean skincare, has drawn on these findings extensively, with snail extract becoming a widely used ingredient in creams and serums marketed for wound healing, moisturization, and reduction of hyperpigmentation. The biological basis for these claims lies in part of the snail's own use of mucus to protect and repair damage to its own body surface. From Hippocrates to K-beauty, this quietly useful secretion has been finding applications across millennia, adapting to the needs of each era without fundamentally changing what it is. Rhodium is a platinum group metal so rare and so specifically used that it has periodically traded at more than 10 times the price of gold. Global annual production amounts to only a few dozen tons, and its price is highly sensitive to shifts in supply and demand. The primary driver of demand is its role in automotive catalytic converters. Rhodium is uniquely effective at converting nitrogen oxides, a major component of vehicle exhaust, into harmless nitrogen gas. As emissions regulations have tightened globally, demand has increased accordingly. The fortunes of rhodium are therefore closely tied to the automotive industry, and the expanding adoptions of electric vehicles, which do not require catalytic converters, is expected to reshape the demand structure in the coming decades. Rhodium also finds use in chemical manufacturing, electronics, and glass making, valued for its corrosion resistance and high melting point. Low in name recognition, but extraordinary in value, rhodium is a reminder of how niche industrial requirements can make an obscure element extraordinarily precious. Rome's roads were among the most consequential engineering achievements of the ancient world. At the height of the empire, the network of paved highways stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, with major trunk roads covering approximately 80,000 kilometers, and the full system, including secondary routes, estimated at well over 400,000 kilometers. The saying that all roads lead to Rome reflects the literal structure of that network, which radiated outward from the capital in every direction. Roman road construction was built for permanence. Layers of gravel and crushed stone were topped with fitted stone paving, and sections of this surface survive to this day. Milestones were placed at irregular intervals, allowing travelers and soldiers to track their position and calculate distances. The network served three essential functions simultaneously: rapid movement of troops, transportation of goods, and transmission of information. And it was the physical infrastructure that made governing a territory of that scale possible. Roads, in that sense, were not just a product of empire, but one of its primary instruments. Polar bears are capable of running at speeds of approximately 40 kilometers per hour, a pace that rivals the fastest human sprinters, despite regularly exceeding 500 kilograms in body weight. This speed is generated by powerful hind limb muscles and by their large, broad feet, which function as effective propulsion surfaces. In water, they are equally formidable. Individuals have been documented swimming continuously for over 100 kilometers across open ocean, using their front limbs to paddle, while the hind limbs serves as a rudder. Their aquatic endurance is exceptional among mammals. In recent decades, as sea ice has retreated due to climate change, polar bears have been forced to swim increasingly long distances between ice platforms. Not as a demonstration of capability, but as a necessity driven by shrinking habit. The gap between what a polar bear can physically do and what the changing environment is asking of it illustrates the pressure that climate change places even on the most physically capable animals. Strength and endurance are not sufficient when the landscape that supports life is disappearing. The Eiffel Tower is not a rigid structure. It is designed to flex. In strong winds, the top of the tower can sway up to approximately 7 centimeters in either direction. This is not a flaw, but an intentional feature of the engineering. A completely rigid structure has nowhere to send the force of the wind. Instead, that energy accumulates in the metal, causing fatigue, crackling, and eventually failure. By building in elasticity, the designer allows internal forces to be absorbed and distributed rather than resisted, significantly extending the structure's lifespan. Temperature also affects the tower's dimensions. In summer heat, thermal expansion can add up to 15 centimeters to the tower's height. Gustave Eiffel incorporated these physical realities into his calculations from the outset, and the result, a structure that has stood without major structural incident for well over a century, validates the approach. The principle that flexibility, not rigidity, is what allows a structure to endure under sustained stress has since become a foundational concept in the design of tall buildings and long bridges. The Hadal Zone, ocean depths below 6,000 meters, exists under pressures exceeding 600 times that of the atmosphere at the surface. Yet, exploration has consistently found life there. Amphipods, sea cucumbers, polychaete worms, and other organisms adapted to conditions that would crush most life forms. What has also been found consistently at the depth is contamination. High concentrations of microplastics and persistent organic pollutants have been detected in the bodies of deep sea organisms in locations including the Mariana Trench. These particles reach the deep ocean through the same process that delivers organic matter. They sink. In an environment where nutrients are scarce and anything descending from above is a potential food source, plastic particles are ingested alongside the organic materials they resemble. The discovery that human industrial activity has reached the deepest and most inaccessible places on the planet, environments that no person has ever stood in, is a measure of the scale at which we have altered the Earth's systems. A giant panda cub at birth weighs somewhere between 100 and 200 grams, while its mother typically weighs between 100 and 120 kilograms. The newborn is therefore roughly 600 to 900 times lighter than the animal that gave birth to it, making the size differential one of the most extreme among non-marsupial mammals. The explanation lies in a reproductive mechanism called embryonic diapause. After fertilization, the blastocyst does not immediately implant in the uterine wall. It can remain dormant for weeks or months, meaning the actual period of fetal development before birth is very short, and the cub arrives in a profoundly undeveloped state with non-functional eyes and ears, pink skin, and only sparse fur. The mother, despite being hundreds of times larger, cradles this fragile newborn with her forelimbs and devotes herself entirely to its care. Over the following years, the cub grows into one of the largest animals in the habitat. The journey from a creature small enough to fit in a human hand to a fully grown panda is one of the more dramatic growth arcs in the animal kingdom. Beneath the desert surface of Saudi Arabia lies an enormous reservoir of groundwater accumulated during the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, when the region received far more rainfall than it does today. Known as fossil water, it has been sitting in the sandstone and gravel layers deep underground ever since, largely cut off from the modern water cycle and receiving virtually no replenishment under current climatic conditions. Beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, the Saudi government drew on this resource extensively for large-scale agricultural irrigation, achieving wheat production at a scale that seemed improbable in one of the world's driest environments. As the depletion of the aquifer became apparent, policy shifted towards scaling back water-intensive farming. Today, a combination of desalination and managed groundwater use sustains the country's water supply. But the long-term challenge of fossil water exhaustion remains unresolved. Water that fell as rain during an ice age, filtered through rock over millennia, and now flows from a tap in the 21st century, is a striking illustration of how the Earth's history and the modern human life are more connected than they appear. Conventional plastic made from petroleum has long been criticized for its reliance on fossil fuels and its persistence in the environment, and the development of plant-based alternatives have accelerated considerably in recent years. One of the most established bioplastics is polylactic acid, PLA, produced by fermenting the starches and sugars in crops, such as corn and sugarcane, to create lactic acid, which is then polymerized. It is used in packaging, disposable cutlery, and medical sutures. Sugarcane-derived bioethanol can also be processed into materials with properties similar to conventional polyethylene and polypropylene, enabling applications in bottles and containers. Because the plants used as feedstock absorbed carbon dioxide during their growth, bioplastics are considered closer to carbon neutral than petroleum-based equivalents. Important caveats apply, however. Plant-driven does not automatically mean biodegradable, and many bioplastics require the controlled conditions of industrial composting facilities to break down. They will not decompose in a home compost pile or in the open environment. The crops themselves also require agricultural land and significant water to grow. Bioplastics represent a meaningful reduction in fossil fuel dependence, but are not a complete solution to the broader problem of plastic waste. Johann Sebastian Bach is celebrated today as one of history's great composers, but during his lifetime, his reputation rested on a rather different distinction. Among the skills for which he was most widely respected was his expertise in an organ evaluator, a specialist invited by churches to assess newly built instruments and verify that they meet the required standard of quality. The organ was the most important instrument in church worship, and its performance directly affected the quality of religious services, making expert assessment a serious and valued service. Bach was known for the depth of his knowledge of the organ construction acoustics, and his evaluations were trusted accordingly. He would examine each pipe for pitch and tone, test the action of the keys, and provide detailed recommendation to the builders. As a composer, however, his reputation during his lifetime was considerably more modest, and the large-scale rediscovery of his music came decades after his death, triggered most famously by Felix Mendelssohn's 1827 revival of the St. Matthew Passion. Bach's trajectory from celebrated craftsmanship to canonical composer is one of the clearest examples of how artistic greatness is not always recognized in its own time. The ceremonies most familiar to Olympic audiences today, the raising of flags, the playing of national anthems, the three-tiered podium, were not part of the games from their inception. When the modern Olympics began in Athens in 1896, nothing resembling the current medal ceremony existed. The practice of raising national flags began to be incorporated around the 1904 St. Louis Games, and the full ceremony evolved further across subsequent editions. Even the gold, silver, bronze medal structure was not present at the beginning. At the first modern games, the winner received a medal and an olive branch rather than gold. The formula of national anthem, national flag, and three-level podium was assembled gradually over decades rather than introduced as a unified design. The spectacle that now seems inseparable from the games and that ties athletic achievement so visibly to national identity is the product of a long historical accumulation rather than a founding intention. Rabbits are often associated with timidity and nervous behavior, but they are also capable of expressing intense joy in an unmistakable and rather spectacular way. The behavior is known as a binky, a sudden high vertical leap combined with a twist of the body and a kick of the hind legs before landing. It happens quickly and without obvious warning, and people who have never seen it before are often startled. Among rabbit owners, a binky is recognized as one of the clearest signs that an animal is experiencing genuine happiness. It tends to occur when a rabbit has space to move freely, receives a favorite food, or is engaged in play. The behavior has also been observed in wild rabbits, suggesting it is an instinctive rather than learned expression. Researchers studying animal emotion have noted blinking as an example of how physical expression of positive states is not limited to mammals with more complex behavioral repertoires. That a creature so often described as quiet and undemonstrative can suddenly launch itself into the air in an expression of pure delight says something about the depth of feeling that can exist in animals we might otherwise underestimate.